Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 779th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Every Ocean Hughes and Ksenia M. Soboleva. We're thrilled to welcome poet Jeanetta Rich here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land that we're speaking from. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. Every Ocean Hughes is a transdisciplinary artist working in performance, photography, video, and text. Hughes has exhibited widely in solo and group exhibitions internationally and currently has 2 shows up in New York, a live side, a solo show at the Whitney Museum, and Signals, How Video Transformed the World at MoMA. Collaboration is central to Hughes's practice, including as an editor and co-founder of the queer feminist journal and artist collective LTTR, lyric writing for several bands, and costume design. Every is the Sachs Visiting Professor at University of Pennsylvania. And our host today, New York-based writer and art historian, Dr. Ksenia M. Soboleva, specializes in queer art and culture. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. Her writings have appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, among other publications. She's currently the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Gender and LGBTQ+ History at the New York Historical Society, and is currently co-editing the first monograph on Trial Bloom, a lesbian gallery of the early 1990s. And with that, it's my absolute pleasure to pass it over to Ksenia.
Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail for making this possible. It's always such a pleasure. And thank you, Every, for joining. I'm a fan. Before we start, I actually I have some options. What do you think?
Well, those are the ones that match mine, huh?
Yeah, I think so. Should we go?
Yeah, where are those?
Okay. All right. So, Every, I'm so happy you're here. I know you've had a really busy few weeks, few months. I was fortunate to see all 4 parts of your exhibition at the Whitney, titled The Live Side, and we can get the slideshow going. So for those of you who were not able to see everything, essentially there are 4 parts. There is an installation of Every's series of photographs titled The Piers Untitled, which started in 2009 and are ongoing. And that is up throughout the duration of the exhibition. Then there was a performance, Help the Dead, which first premiered in 2019 and was performed at the Whitney for 3 days in late January. And then there was a film and sculptural installation titled One Big Bag, which is from 2021 and was on view at the Whitney for 4 days in mid-February. And then most recently, last weekend, you premiered your performance River, which was specifically commissioned by the Whitney. And it's been really fun rushing over to the Whitney to catch everything. And the last 3 were inspired by your training in death care. And I know that it's important to you to really see these 3 in continuation. And so I want to talk about them in order of their appearance. So perhaps we could start with Help the Dead. And I have to say that song is still stuck in my head, and I'm a terrible singer, so I won't do that to you. But could you talk a little bit about how you were introduced to the practice of death care, and how you decided to then pursue training as a death doula yourself, and then how that was translated into this performance, which, for those who don't know, really takes the format of a workshop meets musical.
Workshop meets musical. introduced, pursue, and then the form of HTD. I'm making notes.
Okay,
Um,
I should do that soon.
yeah, Help the Dead was the first in this series. It's from 2019. I had some friends die when I was a child. And I always knew that, or as I was growing up, I came to realize that that was something I was going to have to take care of, you know, when I was an adult, was like the impact that this has had on me. Several of my best friends died in different accidents when I was young. So then when my beloved grandmother, who I also, you know, was like my sister and my mother as well, when she died, I was the first time I actually had the opportunity to be present with the death and to care for it rather than, you know, hear bad news or experience that trauma of a quick and more difficult or violent kind of loss. So it was when I was able to be present with her and care for her, that then after that, instead of pushing the grief away, I said yes to it. And yeah, while I was caring for her while she died, I started to kind of like, you know, I was sitting bedside and I was wondering what tools, you know, were needed. And I remembered that my two mothers, who are best friends, I've always said that I have three moms and together that they raised me. My mom and her best friend had long been hospice volunteers. So I remembered that, and I turned to hospice, and I was looking at some of the literature that they made available just quite simply on a website. You know, there's very first looks at this material. Yeah, and then in the months following, while I was experiencing grief, I turned towards that a little bit more. This was like a time in life where I really had like a pause on all other activities. Like I did my job, which at the time was being an art professor, and I didn't do anything else. I didn't think about making art, and I didn't really participate in any of the other kind of cultural scenes that I have been in my life. It really is just kind of became this kind of valley. And then months of that where I was thinking, you know, I'm not sure I'll ever do that kind of thing again. I feel like I really let go is how I think of it. And inside of that, I just after time started to think again, you know. And it was at the similar time that I was having these ideas about being of service. I have some wonderful close friends, you know, really are, you know, really giving something back to the world. And I was wondering what I could do outside of an art practice that would be of service. And then I realized that it was that I can turn towards death, or at least not turn away from it. And in that is a skill set that I could work with, and I could be an offering, really. So inside of that grief, I became curious again, and I went to the first training. And it was just kind of it was such an experience. It's like a revelation. Like people who go to these things, especially the more grassroots kinds of trainings, of which there are many, it's becoming formalized like now in the last very few years. But I'd say even since I started, you can see how much the field is growing and changing. But attending these kinds of grassroots trainings I mean, I loved it. Obviously, I've continued to do it. But people show up with real purpose and with a story. So I did not go as an artist. I did not go to take notes, to make an artwork. But while I was there, I was like, you know, I was turned on. I was excited. I was inspired. I was like, there's really something here. And I started to take notes, still not knowing or having any purpose or even horizon for what that would be, but just really, you know, being excited about being a part of this thing. So that's how I first started to do it. and why I then pursued it. I met someone at that training, and then I went and studied with her again elsewhere, and then have just kind of hopped on. And then I actually, for a lot of you are probably New York based, I did a year-long training with the New York Zen Center on contemplative care. So there are a lot of really interesting options out there. Yeah, and then from that, I Help the Dead was the first work I made after that, after the, kind of experiencing this run of trainings. And it was really, there's a lot to say. This project has meant a lot to me, because it was different than other things I'd been making in the past many years of my art life. It was the first time I ever fully scripted anything beginning to end. It was the first time I wasn't in the work myself. It was the first time that I ever made a performance you could do more than once, so that wasn't just completely kind of site and context specific. So many things kind of distinguished it for me as being like a new path. And I was very excited. I emailed Geo YX and Colin Self, who you see here. And then there's Tiny Carlson Savci, who's in the background. But I emailed Geo and Colin, and both of them were, we've been friendly. We actually weren't great friends at the time. Now we are, I'm happy to say. But Geo wrote back very generously and was like, I couldn't even fully explain the project, but just my wish to be making this thing, and was like, yeah, whatever it is, I'll do it, and that's always I'm really honored by that kind of trust and that response. And so then I actually wrote the performance with Geo and Colin in mind, with their voices and their embodiment. And that's how I was also able to write that song that you mentioned. With them, of course, I would share writing credit, because I just make this kind of very simple voice memo and the lyric. So basically kind of the melody and the lyric, and then they utterly transformed it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I first became familiar with your work through your project on David Jeanetta Rich, where you photographed yourself wearing a mask of David's face, in reference to a work that he made where he had friends wear a mask of Rimbaud and then photograph them in different parts of New York City. And I actually think that it's a common misconception that he is wearing the mask and he's photographing himself, because it sort of overlooks this very collaborative aspect of that project, and the intimacy, and of course collaboration is so key to your practice as well. But I know that these three most recent projects are specifically about death care, but I guess to me, your work, at least the work that I'm familiar with, has in a way always been in dialogue with the dead, and with queer ancestry and queer genealogy, and the installation of photographs, which perhaps we can return to those just for a second. When you moved to New York in 1999, you found yourself really gravitating towards the piers as this site of queer loss and queer love, and really, as I think you've said, an unmarked queer memorial, right? And I was looking at these photographs of the piers, and it struck me that there's something almost notational about them. The piers almost become like a score, like a score for a requiem, perhaps. I think that's so interesting to think about the piers as a requiem, as a token of remembrance. And of course, with the AIDS crisis, which is ongoing, but during the 80s and the 90s, within the queer community, death care was also a given, because people would either return to their families and often not get a say in how they died, or they would have friends and lovers and chosen family to take care of them. And to me, having written my dissertation on that period, what always struck me was that this was really a community whose death came to define their life by dominant society, and I wonder how much of this project is also rooted in your experience of moving to New York in 1999 and immersing yourself in queer community and hearing the stories of queer caretaking from your elders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I started to do the death care project, so pre 2019, when I was still in like in an inquisitive phase of the project, where I was one of the deepest root was that, was this kind of queer relationality that I was inheriting, when I moved to New York, this those networks of care that were so crucial, that were self-organized, that were chosen family, and of course, like, the politics of neglect and discrimination that caused that. And I was one of the very first, if not maybe the first thing that I read when I was pursuing this as a real interest, was the history of like the hospice centers that developed in San Francisco. So like the Zen Hospice was one, and there were a few that were they emerged in order to take care of the AIDS patients and crisis in the community at that time. So that was like the deepest root. On a personal level was the story I just shared, which is like having grown up going into hospice houses, having lost my friends as a young person, and then my grandmother. But it was then kind of from the other side of my life. So those are like kind of the 2 feet that I walked forward with into the project, which is then why at the Whitney, of course it matters that these piers are now outside of the Whitney's window, of course, that's why I suggested that this be there. But it's also, as an artist, I can clearly look back to my very first project, which was the David Vonarovich project, and tie this thread all the way along, that has been around, as you said, kind of, death care, queer death, queer genealogy. So that was it. It was really about having this photos as the container that each time you came, hopefully people could attend more than once, although, that's a big ask in a busy city, but you managed to do it. Thank you. But so you walk through the space of the gallery of the piers, and that establishes the ground in which you then go into the theater each time. So you then go into the theater for Help the Dead, into the theater for One Big Bang, into the theater for River. And so that this place, this history, is tied to that work.
Yeah.
That was always my wish,
Yeah.
that it becomes the ground from which the current works are made.
Yeah.
These,
Well,
the important thing with these images to me, just to say also, is that half of them are like straight photographs, that's a joke, and then the other half are collaged, so, and each collage has just one cut. You can see here on the left there is a piling. That large piling is cut out of black paper and sits just a little elevated on the surface of the image, and the one next to it you see has a strong diagonal cut through it. So it's that's another important kind of relationship, I guess, to this ground, which is one that's not entirely or just to be taken at as is. It was always planned to be altered and negotiated and worked with.
And what about the frames? Do you always frame these in colorful frames, or they were first presented in the Whitney Biennial in 2010? Yeah.
Yeah, in a very abbreviated form. That was a busy year for me, and also a few, you know, I knew this project wasn't finished. I shot them in 2009, printed them early 2010 for that biennial, and it was like this really kind of quick period in my life where I was a very young artist and saying yes to things, and of course said yes to the biennial. So I printed 3, and for the last like whatever 20 years, I have looked at them a few times a year, the negatives. I've always known that I would return to them, and also was just kind of like living with them and letting it percolate. And so then when Adrienne Edwards, the curator at the Whitney, contacted me, and I thought, okay, if I'm going to work in the theater, I want to work with that gallery as you enter the theater. I like to think about how people arrive to performance as much as the performance itself within that frame of the work. So how do we get there? And this was an incredible chance to really think about how are we arriving into that space. So then this became the time after 20 years to revisit these and to finally finish them in form. You know, like the frames weren't like this in 2010. The walls weren't either. This was the chance for me to really push it as far as I wanted to, and to kind of and I love installation. I love working. Like I'm not sure I've ever really accepted a white wall.
Yeah.
I can't think of an exhibition that, you know, where I've been and then with the frames, it's really about, for me, having these on the site of the Whitney where you can turn towards the window and they're often already there. You know, it's very much about this kind of framing and perception of the site. And I think the color and the frames are really trying to make that point. One of the images is a framed image on top of the same image that is then in wall size, mural size, and then in the conference room. So if you turn this way, you see the piers, and if you turn this way towards the building, you see them again. It's down, down, down. Maybe you don't have it in. Oh, there it is. Yep.
Yeah.
So that kind of duplication, framing.
Yeah.
What's
outside the frame. Yeah. And I have to say, you know, speaking of the experience of entering the space and entering the space of your performance, what was so lovely to me is that every performance that I went to, when I entered the space, I would just see all my friends that I didn't even know were coming. You know, it was like it also became such a you know, like a queer reunion almost. I want to talk about One Big Bag, which is a film, and there is a sculptural installation element to it, and it features Lindsay Rico, who plays a death doula and essentially walks the viewer through her toolkit of items that she uses as a death doula in the caring for the dead. Let's play a little bit, just like 50 seconds, and then we can go into a discussion.
The living and the dead, they transform together. Now, the ice. If you want to keep a body at home for 1 day or up to 3, you need good routines around icing. Rigor mortis comes and goes after 2, 3 days. Most people know that a corpse stiffens, but they don't know that they then relax out again later. Depending on the different ice technologies you might use, that will determine your schedule for swapping it out and keeping them cold. A note, and this is a little intense the first time you hear it, use half the ice for a baby or a child. You don't want to freeze them through. The goal is to chill the corpse so the body can stay home and be honored. I overchilled, almost kind of froze a child in my early days. It was brutal for everyone, and it took me a while to forgive myself, so know your ice technologies well.
I have to ask, is that an autobiographical reference?
No.
So at the Whitney, the film is presented in a room where the items from the bag are suspended from the ceiling, and we have installation shots, I believe. And what's so interesting is that the height of the objects corresponds to where on the body it would be used. But something that I'm curious about, that I wanted to ask you, is that it corresponds to the body in the upright position.
Yeah.
So it almost corresponds more actually to the death doula than the body that they are caring for. What is that? What is the tension there?
For me, it was, it's to the visitor, so that when they enter the space, and certainly when maybe you first enter the door, you're like, what's all this junk? Or why is there a diaper, a tampon, a bag of pads, alcohol, rubbing alcohol, a bell? It's a strange collection of things, glue,
Yeah.
Advil. Then after a few minutes or very quickly, you see that the death doula who's performing in the film, that they are physically navigating this stuff. It's all around them. They have this fluency. They speak of it here. They lean down and touch with this. I wrote the script in a way that it's like I kind of color coded it. And it was like, if you could think like verse, chorus, or something, but so that it goes between the explication of each tool, of each object, and then the kind of narrativizing or expository, so we go back and forth. And then so a viewer is going to say, oh, like, this person is skilled in their environment, because she's not looking, where is that thing? She knows exactly where it is. So she is your guide. I wanted her to have that confidence and authority in which you are just with her. So there's no hesitation on her behalf. And that then she's telling you what these things are for. And then you notice that your body is in relationship to those things. So first you walk through, and then we provide seating. It's very important to me that with this film that people have kind of as much comfort and autonomy as can be offered in an art institution. I'm pretty specific about chairs. I like there to be space between the chairs, that you're seated and you can have a sense of yourself, because the material is quite intense, as you see in that was 50 seconds of a 40 minutes of material. I really like what you point out, that it's more towards this towards a vertical human being, not a horizontal one. But you can also say that, in this question of the hanging, this thing about height and where it's used on the body, that I do try to, kind of address different viewers in that, I would say.
Plus that I think the paradox, of course, is that we can only really study death from the alive side.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay. The experiences that Lindsay references, were you pulling those from the workshops? How did you build the script?
Yeah, it's pulled from the workshops. It's pulled from 2 interviews I did with Jerry Grace Lyons and another doula, whose sorry name just escaped me, but it'll come back. And that's so weird. Sorry. Sure, her company's called Doula Damn Thing. I can at least reference that. She's out closer to Seattle. So my experience, personal experience, some of these anecdotes are my own, my study in the workshop, and then I did 2 interviews. That's where the material itself comes from. And then, yeah.
And do you find that because such a
her name's Lupe Tejada Diaz. Sorry, I really wanted to say that.
I blame COVID. This happens to me all the time, and I just such an important part of the script is where Lindsay says, "I want everyone to know that they have options." right? And that you can make choices. And I I was thinking about, because I saw you briefly yesterday, and then I went on a long walk after, and I was thinking more about it, because I told you about my great grandmother. And I mean, for those who don't know, I grew up in a Muslim household. My great grandmother was a very stoic, very harsh person, and would never show any emotion, would never voice wanting something or desiring something or being afraid of something. The entirety of her life that I knew her, and I lived with her. And then when she was dying, and she was very aware of the fact that she was dying, and in Tatar culture, you give gifts when somebody passes away, and an important gift is a handkerchief. And so she was sewing her own handkerchiefs to gift to people at her burial. And but in Muslim culture, when somebody dies, they have to be buried within 24 hours. Their bodies washed, wrapped in muslin, and then suspended directly into the ground. But she had requested that her body be placed in a coffin, because the earth where we were living in Arkhangelsk was too wet, she thought. And she was from Tatarstan, and that's a whole different, another story how we moved there. But she didn't like the idea of the worms getting to her body quite so quickly. And so she asked for a coffin. And it is the only memory that I have of my great grandmother ever voicing a desire for something. So I think it's interesting that in death, she allowed herself to want something, to make a choice. And so I'm curious, in your experience, do you find that the choices that people make for their death reflects the choices that they made in their life?
Unfortunately, I'd say I still don't think people are making a lot of choices about their deaths. I think when somebody does, it's news. We'll get an article about that or something. I'd say it's far from being common practice that people are being thoughtful and or non-normative about death. The green burial and green death care, so as in green environmental, is a really growing field, but still the numbers on that are very small, but it's growing a lot. And yeah, I'm a student and a fan of those practices, so I'm excited about that. But I'd say people are still, we're still very far from being able to approach our own deaths. You quoted the line where I'm saying yes, to give people options, but it's also, self-determination is the phrase that I use. If I was going to pull out one line from this film, it's actually really close to this scene that we're looking at the still from, when she's pacing the box. She says, if you can diminish fear, it's a beautiful thing to witness. And that's in reference to the first time somebody touches a dead body, they realize it's still the body of the person that they loved. They don't have to be afraid of it. And in that, diminishing fear is beautiful. That's also something that really I hold close and is in the heart of this project. So self-determination and diminishing fear, I would say, are, the core tenets of this work.
I think that this fear of death and the distance that we now take from it is also a very firstly a Western and I think a relatively post-medieval, because people used to, firstly there used to be more of an acceptance towards death. It was just something that would come.
It's a matter of life. It's a matter of fact. It's like people died much younger. Of course, now we have these different expectations of life in which we are like fulfilled individuals instead of just working parts of a community to survive, you know? It really isolates death in its individualism differently.
Yeah, and hospitals. I mean, there didn't used to be hospitals. It was a given that you would be washing the body of your loved one who just passed away. So death was just all around people, and it was closer. And what about all the people that don't have options? Whether it's because the death is sudden or because they don't have family, biological or chosen, where does that go?
Well, I guess there are different ways to think about it. You know, it's like the dead don't have options. But also then it's for the survivors, you know. In both Help the Dead and One Big Bag, it's been very important to me that these are not projects about like a good death, you know, solely about a good death. They are providing information within an aesthetic format, you know, like a performative format. But they are equally addressed to the conditions in which you are able to make choices. And then also, hopefully, if you have been in circumstances in which you couldn't make choices, or in which you've experienced traumatic and or violent deaths, that some of this information is still able to provide maybe, I don't know if this is too bold or something, but like a healing path. You know, there are ways in which we can still reconcile and work on traumatic death experiences. Once you've had no control, you know, you've experienced it like that, there are still things to be done where you can, you know, try and get a little bit of like relief. And so these projects both, I think, really hopefully are attuned to that as well.
Yeah, and I really liked what you said to me about that this is performance and not theater, because you allow it to be more than one thing.
Mhm.
That really stayed with me. Let's talk about River, because that is the most recent. Just premiered last weekend. Congratulations! And there we have it. There is a wave, and the wave is it's a recurring motive in your practice. Can we go to a shot of the set design? And I want to ask you a few things, but why river, and what is your relationship to water? I mean, obviously every ocean, and also the wave. When you read about grief, it's often written that grief comes in waves, right? And really any intense emotion, like I feel like when you're overcome by an emotion, it feels like a wave. And I personally am obsessed that the word motion is embedded in the word emotion. So why the river? Why the wave?
Well, the river is, this was a commission by the Whitney. So, you know, I designed this piece specifically for this room. The river is the Hudson River. It's the river that the pilings in the photographs are in that river. It's also, I'll say something after this, but so water in general, you know, it's always, you know, it's transformative, it's mythic, to me, it's always been a refuge. I remember when I was a kid, I grew up in a very rural place on the water. And I think, yeah, just some of my most important private moments were underwater. There's a line in River about the water being just above your lip and under your nose, you know, this kind of sense of like almost not being able to breathe. But I used to just hover there with the water at my lip line like that. Sorry.
I said me too. I remember doing that, like in the bathtub. And
yeah,
like just right
yeah,
at
and it's always been a meditative and I guess I'm just a water person. It's been very all my life. It's something, and I never really even thought about it, you know. But but yeah, I grew up on it. And but here, yeah, it's the Hudson. It's also the River Styx, of course. That's very important. Like this project is really different than the other ones. Help the Dead and One Big Bag are really concrete. They're grounded in like a human body, in performance, and in a corpse, and in materiality and sociality. You know, this project was yeah, it was very different in that it was about the stories that we tell related to those things. So as much as like practical death care and spiritual care and self-determination are things, also so are stories. We need them just as much. They are as crucial in these processes. And it's like the story of who we are and the choices we make if we're still related to self-determination and community, but it's also the stories of religion and folktale, which is like, why are we alive and why do we die? You know, and what is the meaning of it all? So so yeah, the firsts are very grounded, you know, in this. And then with this one, I kind of and so then I thought that river, the work is, you know, quite simply titled, it's just river. But it gives us like a new site. It's not the site of the body, it's the site of the river, of that flow. In that there is a rhythm to me, there is descent. I wanted the work to be about going down. The refrain is I went down. Yeah.
Yeah, I realized I didn't mention, for those who haven't seen it, that the sort of core of the performance is that there are two characters that have this mythic ability to cross to the underworld. Or I guess one of them does, and the other one is ashore.
One of them does. The other thing is like that in that language, I really always was like wanted to kind of delicately thread between the idea that they're crossing to the underworld and just an underground. You know, I like in this idea of crossing, which is what I'm writing about, or you know, it's as much about going into an underground culture, you know, as into an underworld. Just want to say again, this is Gio Wyax, who was also in Help the Dead, and then Lindsay Rico, who was in One Big Bag. So kind of who were in the first and the second iterations of the series. And then in the background here is Timothy Johnson, and Aaron Ricks is also a performer, and Nora Brown. Just want to say their names.
Yeah, and I want to hear more about your collaboration with all of them. And I was really intrigued by Timothy's character, who is in a bathtub, and I was sitting kind of far away, so I didn't realize what they were doing, and then you told me that it's a piling of pennies, and at some point the character says, right, I am Charon.
Yeah.
Who was the ferryman.
They ask if they are.
Oh
They
yeah.
say, am I? Not I am. Yeah.
Who was the ferryman for Hades. So yes, actually, let's this is a good point to maybe talk about those collaborations, because collaboration is such an intrinsic part of your practice. I know that when you worked with Lindsay on One Big Bag, that was the first time that you were working with someone who you didn't already know closely. So where did the other collaborators for River come in, and what is your relationship to them, and what was the process like?
Well, you know, Gio, who's imaged here on the right, is a good friend and was in Help the Dead. And so that was like kind of an established character and role and gravity for the piece. I could write the piece because I know Gio can perform it and carry it. It's really extraordinarily talented in a way that just really shocks me all the time, even though we've been in relationship for years. And then Lindsay, who was in One Big Bag, who's just an extraordinary performer. It's really wild experience to write something and then have people like memorize words, like as a writer, you know, when somebody like internalizes and embodies the script in such a way, and that it moves me, you know, and moves, you know, others, as evidenced. And then, yeah, and then it was really just a matter of like wanting to work with the talent that is in New York. You know, it's really a thing, like how many extraordinary artists there are in this city. And so I just kind of let myself pay attention to people and keep my eyes open in these first few weeks that I was in town for the other projects, installing the photos, doing Help the Dead. And it was actually Timothy Johnson, who is the bathtub character you speak of, and then Aaron Ricks, who is also in this performance. I met them around Help the Dead. So Aaron had shown up to be what kind of a walk-on character. I don't need to get in all that. And then Timothy showed up as a friend and colleague and old, you know, old New York friend of Gio's. And I'm just a people person. I respond to people, you know, their energy and what they're going to contribute to a project, how they will be to work with. And then I just trust my instincts, not knowing anything else about them. I'm just like, hi, would you like to do this thing? So,
and Aaron's choreography in the performance is that they're almost like a river. They're moving throughout the space on the floor. Were you envisioning it as?
Yeah, I worked with Monica Mirable as a movement director, and then also want to mention Tuche Yasak, who was the lighting designer, and Montana Levi Blanco to costume design. In this series of works, it's the first time that I've kind of, you know, not really done everything myself. Usually it's so much fun to be able to call on and have conversations and really work with people who have these specialties. Real pleasure. But what did you ask me?
Just whether they were meant to, in a way, be a metaphor.
Oh, the river. Yeah. Not, you know, not exactly. I would say that it was, you know, my wish for both Timothy and Aaron, who have the more abstract roles in the performance. Gio and Lindsay both have a lot of speech. You know, it's a very kind of very verbal performances that they're giving. Timothy and Aaron are more embodied, a little bit more abstract, and both of them for me were like about this kind of sense of time and rhythm. And with Aaron Ricks and the way that he was like moving around the space, it was almost like a little ritualistic, but it was Aaron to me was the character who had the most confidence in the room. Gio was performing a character who was new to this skill. They newly acquired this skill where they can cross, they can descend, and they can return. They can make a round trip to the underworld. Whereas Aaron was really, you know, had this embodied confidence in which they were making the space by constantly circling it. So working with Monica on the movement direction and with Aaron themselves, like as the performer, it was trying to find that kind of sense of confidence, and then also the one line in which we directly address that figure is saying they think that outfit makes them invisible, which I don't know if we have an image of the outfit here, but it's not invisible. It's absolutely fabulous. Like, but it's this like kind of distinction between like how you move through the world and yeah, just like this kind of sense of crossing
Emotion.
but
And then the banjo.
yes.
When was the banjo conceived? How was it conceived? And then there are actually two banjos. There is Gio, who's playing the banjo, and then you have a banjo player who is Nora Brown.
It doesn't look like we have a picture of Nora here.
Yeah.
Nora Brown is an extraordinary talented younger musician. I was a fan of her music before I realized that she was a younger person. She was so accomplished. And also before I understood that she was adjacent to, you know, my community. So she like, I realized that then that I had friends who knew her, were her neighbors, that she was from Brooklyn, that she lived in New York. So and it was at the exact time that I was looking for a banjo player for this performance. This is Gio with the banjo here, and in the script, like his character is learning the banjo, and as did Gio learn the banjo in order to perform and to play in the work. And he's, as I said, very talented, so he did pick it up pretty quick, and wrote the music that he's playing. Whereas Nora is kind of this more established figure. When the audience is arriving, she's already playing. And she's playing these two traditional instrumental songs. At that point, she's not using her voice, but she is setting the tone in the room. And as people arrive, there's already this, you know, there is a sound, there is a rhythm, there is a tone, there is a tool, an instrument. And one of the other refrains in the performance is, the sound makes the path. And that's the idea that when somebody's crossing, somebody here holds open the path through sound. And so Nora, when the audience arrives, is already making that path. And then she also comes out later and plays a cover song of an Anne Honey, a really gorgeous song that she and Gio then harmonize on. Yeah, the banjo to me is really, well, I love the music.
You have to
And-
send me some banjo songs because
Yeah.
I'm not
I
too-
will. I mean, I do. I will. It's also really like, yeah, as I wrote in the script, it's the sound of the river. You know, I wanted it to be something that kind of is a whole sound in and of itself. And of course, it also has some folk echoes. You know, the history of the banjo in America is an interesting one. The African-American history of the banjo in America, and a lot of research that's being done around that in all these years, recent years. And yeah, I like the sound of it. I like the context, you know, it's very, I think it's also a little bit of a surprise, a little unusual, you know, in like kind of contemporary performance, or to have this like beautiful banjo music.
I love when in the performance, Timothy at some point says river meet river.
Yeah.
Is that basically the performance meeting the river outside, or
I mean, it's a pretty abstract line, isn't it?
what is it?
I generally let it stay there. To me, at that particular point, and it's really kind of the it's the emotionality of Gio's character meeting the same in Lindsay's. They're kind of cruising each other. They're strangers when they first begin to talk. And there is this thing when, you know, it's kind of the setup that you meet somebody on a waterfront, you know. I love talking to people I don't know. And so it's just kind of like, at first they're like, you say something, maybe you overshare, you withdraw, you kind of step your way back. They're getting to know each other, and it becomes a little kind of funny / flirtatious at some point, but it's yeah, that's kind of the dynamic. And then when Timothy is never directly kind of addressing the room, but it's just like speech that is vocalized, and just says river meet river. You know, I guess I kind of trust that abstraction. That's that thing about like not pinning something down. Not everything was exactly narratively significant or linear in the way. Timothy's character had this kind of gravity in the room, had this very steady, repetitive presence, was building with the pennies, which is, you know, a reference or an allusion to the pennies, or the coins that people use to pay for their journey across the river Styx. Used to be buried on people's mouths or on their eyes. And you can see them here in this image, that Timothy is there just with a very internalized kind of focus, just making these pilings.
Yeah, and I read them as, I read it as counting something, sort of marking time. And there's one point in the performance that is very autobiographical, because in between One Big Bag and this performance, you experienced another loss, where you lost your father, and at some point the character of Lindsay Tone references that. And at that point, I thought that perhaps that's where the performance was going to go, that it was going to be sort of you telling that story of your father and cracking open your head. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but then I realized you were using it more as sort of situating this performance in the time that you wrote it. Makes sense.
Yeah, it's for me, it's like, I think I mentioned that I had the seed of this whole performance is Gio's character, and this bit of a monologue at the time it was, that about crossing. And I wrote that in one sitting. It really just kind of came right out of me. It was, I think, the weirdest thing I've ever written, and I like weird things, so but it was unusual, and it felt, I was surprised by it, and so then when I came to really kind of working the performance, I had this kind of integral part that I was interested in, and then I was like, what does this need? How do I stage it? What environment's it in? What, all these questions, 10,000 questions that you answer to do such a thing. And I really was interested in kind of establishing the necessity of the story of a descent, of going down, of a little bit of a escape, and then the fact that I kind of have 2 times cracked my head open upon learning of a death. It was curious to me, and yeah, I'll just leave it at that. There's something to say there, but
Yeah. And I mean, I either have read or have written that grief cracks you open as well. I mean, I think it's often referenced as such. We have hit an hour. So I think that perhaps this is the time to open it up to any questions. And if not, I have many more that I could ask. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really fun. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ksenia and Every. That was amazing, and just really, really rich and generous. I really appreciate you both in that conversation. The first question is going to be from G. G, I'll give you the chance to unmute to ask directly.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you, Ksenia and Every. Thank you so much for your work. I haven't been able to attend it, but I feel as though today I've really been brought into it quite a bit. I really appreciate it on so many levels. I get the sense that it's definitely counterintuitive, that we'd be able to experience awe and even a sense of routine in a moment of grief and pain, of our suffering and the suffering of the dying. Could you tell us a bit about where maybe awe and routine and mortality really overlap or connect?
Oh, like AWE?
Yes.
All mortality and routine.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I'll just see what arises in me as you ask that question. Is really, I think some of it's very hard to find beauty in death. but I do think that there are different, if we think about that kind of diminishing of fear, and what kind of love and openness can arise when you do diminish fear a little bit, even if it's momentary. And this is where we really have to take the light where the light shines, find grace when we can. These things are not, they can just arise. It can feel like love. It can feel like relief for a minute. And that's what it makes me think of, and it's not that then we live in that state from here on out, but that in encountering something that is so fundamental to human life, and it's one of like maybe it's the only universal thing, which is that we are gonna die. That if we can accept it, if we can turn towards it, if we can find a relationship to it, that it does open up something else. It certainly has been transformative in my own life.
Thank you so very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, G, for that question. And thank you, Every, for that answer. Eleanor is going to ask the next question.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you so much, Ksenia and Every. This has been an incredible conversation. I want to ask a question about the performances, specifically about the organization of the space. I was really interested in kind of the various vantage points that the audience could have in the depending on where they were sitting in the performance. And I was also really intrigued by the various levels that were present kind of in the, I'll try to just, it's kind of, the audience kind of surrounded a central kind of stage space. And there were two like kind of pyramids is how I could describe it, I guess. Three. And so there was a lot of changing of levels on behalf of the performers, and I'm really interested in that choice. And if you could speak more about that choice, and if you often do performance work in kind of like a non-traditional audience setup. And
I Help the Dead was also in the round, and in that case the audience actually also participates a little. I know not often people like to hear about audience participation, but it actually works in that context because it's really establishing these kind of multivocal kind of narratives in the room. With the performance you saw, River, and these three, they're actually called ziggurats, which when I first drew them in my notebook, I could show you. I didn't know that shape necessarily had a name. But this is what they look like in the notebook, this kind of shape. It's this matter of like wanting to create an environment in which the performers are ascending and descending, and really I wanted them to be above. So it's a little bit like you're perhaps below water level. And that's also what the waves are kind of establishing. And it is also, of course, quite, it has a presence, it's an installation, they're sculptural objects, so it's, I guess on a formal level, I just really love working with space. Maybe I'm shy about that, but I love transforming a room or how you enter a room. So also in those images of the for River, I hung the whole room is curtained, which apparently I'm happy to say it's the first time anybody had curtained that room at the Whitney. And it really, for me, it was this sensuousness, the weight of a blue curtain, that ripple in it, with that light that comes from the window. So it's really giving a lot of texture and weight and color gravity, you know, it gives a real different feeling to that room. And then coupled with these three things that people are going up and down and are above you. I thought it kind of really establishes an environment, you know, a different tone. Yes, of course, the window and the light is important, and Tuche did a really incredible job as a partner and lighting designer, and the way that she and we moved that curtain at a certain point in the performance to welcome the river into the room. Yeah, that's it. I like that stuff a lot.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that amazing question, Eleanor, and thank you for that answer, Every. The last question today is going to be from me.
Okay.
I feel that like tackling the subject of death, and you can kind of see it in the work and in the way you've talked about the work today, kind of carries this tension of the isolation of seeing what is sort of behind the curtain all the time, and facing it head on in your work, while also creating community around allowing others to co-cope in front of something that we build so much to not see in life and in our systems and the way we medicalize death and hide it away. And so I wondered, my question is, what has surprised you most about convening individuals to tackle the subject of death, especially in an institutional context? Because I feel in a way you make co-copers of an audience who form a community of viewers united by something they'll all encounter, whether they realize it or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a really, especially with Help the Dead, in which people are really called into the room in like a pretty specific way, and that they become part of it and can give voice and be a part of it. But with all the works, it's interesting to be presenting contemporary art that touches people in an emotional, spiritual way, and that then I am feel very honored to receive like that feedback. You know, I couldn't have predicted that, though, you know, how it would land like that, but it's really I think a lot of the writing that I'm trying to do with these projects is like presenting the information within these very kind of aesthetic and poetic environments in which you then as a viewer have a lot of autonomy, you know, with such difficult material. With such difficult material, I can't say what you're going to find funny and what you're going to find incredibly sad and difficult. You know what I mean? Like what touches you and what pushes those buttons, you know? So I'm writing it in a way in which you then can find your own path. And it's really like, you know, a lot of us, when we first encounter this material, we think about someone we loved and lost. We think about early experiences, first encounters with loss and with death, and yeah, so it is a thing. It is definitely, I feel a lot of responsibility when I present these works, and I feel also take very seriously the role of hosting. With Help the Dead, I really stand by the door. Some people notice, some people don't. It's a very quiet position, but I'm there. And with each of these, like as people were seated listening to Nora in River, you know, I'm also standing there. It's like, yeah, responsibility and hosting are the kind of quiet factors in the work, I would say. That relate more to kind of viewership and this co-coping that you brought up.
I have
Maybe that
a question, actually, Chloe, if I may. Every, do you ever find yourself, I mean, Help the Dead, for example, is, you know, reperformed. Do you find yourself ever changing anything based on feedback that you receive from the audience the next time that you do the performance?
I have not with these, no.
Cool.
Yeah, I've been maybe a little, we've gotten better at it, you know, as you do, like from the first time they memorized, Gio and Colin memorized it, and we staged it in 3 days. That's like from arrival to first performance, like that's really fast. And that's how good they are. But no, I haven't, and it's really worked in different contexts. You know, we did it in Bergen, Norway, Berlin, Stockholm, and now this was the first time in the US. I made it before the pandemic and had a few opportunities to present it, you know, but then of course live work wasn't happening for quite a while.
Yeah. That is another thing actually that I didn't even ask you about, is that this project, these 3 performance and film span, really, you began right before the pandemic in 2019, and now it's 2023, so it really spans the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and everybody around you has a heightened or a different experience with loss.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
I want to thank everybody for your questions today, and thank Every and Ksenia again for that amazing conversation. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with the poetry reading. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to Jeanetta Rich, who is going to join us and read today. Jeanetta Rich, poet and filmmaker, holds a mirror to desperation so that you can see yourself. Her work is part social critique and screwball scripture. Hailing from Los Angeles by way of whoredom, she writes about the emotional lives of voiceless women, those who have been silenced through poverty and/or lack of education. Her work was included in Tex Zurkun's 30th anniversary issue, The Feminist, and the Quarterless Review. She is writer and director of the short film Desperate LA, and Rich's book Black Venus Flytrap was published in 2021 by Deluge Books. Please join me in welcoming Jeanetta.
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me, everyone. Such a wonderful event. I'll just hop into it. I'll say that very early in my life, very young, from around 3 to 8 years old, in the early 90s, I lost a lot of members of my family to HIV. And those members were the most influential in my life as far as forming my relationship with art and words and film. And so I'd like to start with Blink. Susan stopped receiving invitations to the family reunion long before she lost her beauty. This alienation from existence occurred about the time she retired her A-line dresses and took to wearing leisure suits. According to my mother, this was criminal behavior for a light-skinned woman with a perfect frame and good hair. She slept in stairwells, or sometimes she slept with Magda, the only Puerto Rican woman in the projects. I'd asked Susan, is she Puerto Rican? Susan kept it simple and answered, she Black, she spent time like the rest of us playing spades at barbecues. Susan's smile had no teeth. Magda's had very little, but they smiled before pride was painted rainbow. Back then, the idea of having a life partner was far from their thoughts. They didn't have time for that. It's a funny thing. When you're poor, a year goes by in a week. When you're a woman, 5 years can dissolve within minutes. When you're Black, you spent 20 years just a second ago. And when you're gay, a whole lifetime is gone in the blink of an eye. You could say that as soon as Susan was born, her life was over. Susan kept it simple. The time had come. Susan insisted on sleeping on a cot in my mom's basement. She wanted to die there like a loyal bitch digging up a grave under the house. I have just few memories of Susan. She carried candies in her cargo shorts. Her last words of advice were bestowed to my older sister. She whispered in her ear, "Wear a condom." And there was the time I was scolded by my mother for drinking out of Susan's soda can. I have just a few memories of, forgive me, Susan's fate was perfectly clear to everyone as it faded like the red of her t-shirt, a garment she selected to wear the last time I saw her alive. When the AIDS had become full-blown, this t-shirt clinged to her extremities, exhibiting each point in her shoulder, outlined her breastplate, and unveiled the inverted triangle that marked her life. We all went to the hospital and bunched up at Susan's bedside. My mother and her sisters shouted at her penance so that she'd be healed by the blood. Was her blood that needed healing? At the funeral, Susan was dressed in a baby pink suit with pink lace trim. I remember thinking baby pink is for babies and that it was strange, the suit, more than the funeral itself. I attended lots of funerals when I was little, was very strange. My uncle, bolstering me on his hip, commented that she looked good and with pursed lips gave a single nod of approval. They painted her lips in fuchsia, the fuchsia color all Black women wore in the 90s. This color found at the beauty supply houses, when worn on the lip, Mom also used it as blush, would run below the chin and at the corners of the mouth. Lip liner wasn't sold at the beauty supply, only Black eyeliner. Every fashion trend in America comes out of the necessity, especially for Black women under the confines of European standards of beauty, simply trying to make themselves look presentable. Had the pink suit not been enough, fuchsia on Susan was a spot-on indicator that she was absolutely gone forever. It was the fuchsia color from the beauty supply, but no liner was needed. Her lips were cold. The color didn't bleed at all. My mother didn't smile for a decade. Too much loss in those few minutes made her frown lines deep, and it looked as if her face had been pressed at a dry cleaner. Each end of her mouth lifted one by one. The right side took 5 years, and the left another, leaving a disenchanted smirk in all her photos. The duration of my childhood was spent in the basement, sitting on the cot examining each family photo. There were hundreds, just one of Susan as a little girl, turtleneck, blue jeans, sneakers, freshly styled curls, disheveled from the activity captured. She was scaling up the walls of a very narrow hallway, trying not to fall. I don't know if I have any more time left. There is another where I lost my father 3 years ago, and I acted as a sort of unofficial death doula. It's one of the proudest moments of my life because he was an alcoholic, but he was on his deathbed, and I was able to give him whiskey through a straw. So it's one of my proudest moments, because it was his last day on earth, and I was able to share a drink with him. This one is called Two Black Holes Collided 7 billion years ago, creating a ripple effect that just reached the earth. Yesterday, woke up with swimmer's ear, having been underwater since I drowned when I was little. My father was there, drunk. A stranger saved me that day. Perhaps I'm mistaken. There was no stranger. I'm no survivor. I'm a ghost. I've been drowning for an eternity, it seems, sucked into a black hole. My spirit carried off to an alternate universe. Only sadness prevails here. I found my landlord lingering outside my door, though it was to ask me for the rent. He tells me his father has died. He asks how to cope with loss. I try to explain loss, a ringing in the ear that doesn't go away. You have to play some music loud, Stand by the refrigerator, listen to its motor, press your index finger where it hurts most. The ringing will sink out into the forgotten. He says it's in his chest. Apply pressure there then. Masturbating or prayer, drinking normally helps if your hands are inutile. It doesn't work, he says. When there's no hunt or war to win, men can't accept their uselessness. Coping with loss is accepting it long before it takes place. On my father's deathbed, I fed him whiskey through a straw to avoid drowning his lungs. I fed him whiskey through a straw to save him and was careful not to reveal my plans. But he got angry and said, I'm not a fucking baby, his last coherent statement. My landlord says, that's incredible, touches my shoulder and stares into my eyes. I don't offer the service you're seeking. You're busy with desire, like every man who wants to be king of nothing. You won't even notice the void, not until your daughter has to wipe your ass. Look at your limp dick. Not until your daughter has to wipe your ass. Look at your limp dick. Her heart breaking. Better she than the 25-year-old nurse who could never imagine you anything other than frail. Okay, those are the two I was going to read. So thank you for having me again.
So great.
Oh no, I just want to say, Every, that it's so striking that you sort of envelop the subject of death in so much color. I think it's so wonderful. And I really thank you. And I was listening the whole time, and it just, all these memories started rushing back. And so the work is good because it does sort of bring this, it galvanizes people around the subject that we so, we keep secret, but yeah, and grief, yeah, to crack it open, cracks it open for me too. And so thank you so much for having me again. Okay.
Thank you for such a excellent pairing. I'm so happy to hear you read.
Jeanetta, that was amazing. Thank you so much. That was so incredible and such an extension to the conversation today. So thank you. And thank you again to Every, and thank you to Ksenia. I put a link in the chat just now to One Big Bag, which you can watch on the Whitney Museum's website. And at the Rail, we just want to say thank you as well to Megan from the Whitney Museum for their support in preparing for today's event and providing some images. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like this one, our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with curator Drew Sawyer and Jill Cassett on the occasion of Jimmy DeSana's submission at the Brooklyn Museum. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Roysdon. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today, and happy Friday to all of you.
Thank you so much. That was
Everybody.
so amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Every.
Thank you.
Every.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Ksenia.
much.
Thank you, Janetta, for
Thank you
the
for the amazing reading, Jeanetta.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank
Yeah,
you for the beautiful
Thank
reading.
you. Thank you.
I thought
Hi.